Good day, fellow scapers. My name's Deck, but please call me Hobo, and welcome back to my channel. So if you're like me and have struggled to really get to grips with the new boss dungeon, the Sanctum of Rebirth, then you may have found yourself to be in the right place. It took me really quite a long time to figure out what kind of rotations work for me, and so I decided once I finally found my way to release a bit of a guide, typically what I tend to do. And with these runs and the way I'm doing it, each dungeon takes me less than 10 minutes, so averages out about 6 to 7 runs per hour. So let's jump in. For this guide, I'll be using the necromancy style because it's so widely accessible. In terms of weapons, there's only one thing you need, and that is the main hand Omniguard tier 92 weapon. It's great if you have the Soulbound Lantern, but if you don't, it's no biggie, just use the tier 90 offhand. In terms of armor, first necromancy gear is absolutely phenomenal, but if you don't have this, then the tier 90 Death Dealer outfit should be absolutely fine. For this method to work, you will need the necromancy Zuck cape for this, although if you have the full Zuck cape, that's great too. In terms of jewellery, you'll want the Amulet of Finality containing the tier 90 Death Guard for its special attack. If you don't have it though, that's absolutely fine. You won't have access to a great special attack, but bring the best amulet that you can. For a ring, I would recommend the Occultist ring for this setup, but other DPS rings like the Reaver ring will do absolutely fine as well. For your book slot, I would recommend using something like the Amascut scripture, or alternatively, the Jazz or Wen scriptures are fine as well. For your PVM perks, I'll simply pop a link in the description if you're not sure what you should be using. For your aura, I would recommend either using Equilibrium, as it's a long time aura, or alternatively another good basic DPS aura like the Marjarat. Moving on to your inventory setup. For starters, you'll want an Overload and a Renewal Potion. You'll also want some Adrenaline Renewal Potion as well, and a Restore Potion. Next, you'll want a Vitality Potion for emergencies, as well as a couple of Vom Bombs. I would also recommend that you have the Excalibur and the Ritual Shard for HP and prayer renewal as well. However, if you don't have it, it's not such a big deal. I would highly recommend that you take some runes with you for casting Disruption Shield and Vengeance. They are a great thing to use before you enter the battle, as well as using midway through for some damage mitigation. I would also recommend that you bring some Dreadnoughts with you. Of course, you'll also be wanting to use your necromancy runes as well, so bring your Nexus and bring all of the runes that you have for that for spells like Darkness, as well as Invoke Death, as well as some Ectoplasm for your summons. Finally, you'll want to bring some Blubbers and some Saradomin Brews with you as well. Before we take a look at the bosses, I wanted to take you through a very quick rotation that I use before entering every single fight. So the great thing about these bosses is that they are proximity bosses, so you have to get within range of them before they aggro onto you. This means you have all the time in the world to complete this pre-summoning ritual. To start, I will cast Disruption Shield and Vengeance and turn on my Soul Split as well as my DPS book. Now I've popped a basic rotation on screen for my pre-battle ritual. I use Conjure Army, then Life Transfer, followed by Command Ghost, and then use the spell Invoke Death, followed by Split Soul, and finally Command Skeleton. Now that we've got our setup sorted, let's have a quick overview of the first boss. Vermyx the Broodmother is basically just a snake in the wall. She has a bunch of different mechanics, but in terms of where you'll be getting into her own rotation, will only ever really tend to land on her Moonstone Shard ability. This is due to how much damage you'll be outputting based on a rather flexible rotation. The Moonstone ability will simply light up a tile underneath you and damage you if you stand on that lit section after a few seconds. It will also debuff you with stuns as well as removing your prayers. Simply move out of the way of it and you'll be absolutely fine. The next mechanic is called Wormfire. Now, this isn't something we really have to deal with unless we miss one of the other mechanics, but if you do, it can be easily dealt with. More on that later. One of the other mechanics is Coil Spawn. In all honesty, the spawns can largely be ignored as a harmless mechanic. Another mechanic is something called Soul Rush. Vermyx retreats her head into one of the tunnels and boxes will appear on the floor where souls will bounce onto them. You need to stand inside the squares and redirect the souls back. After successfully redirecting 3 total souls, Vermyx will pop her head back out and become attackable once again. Soul Bomb is the next mechanic, and this is a mechanic similar to the Moon Shard. It is a movement mechanic that will hit you for 7,000 if you don't avoid it, just on a slightly larger scale. Now, most of the time, if you follow the rotation for the majority, you won't really tend to see this. The nice thing is that you can simply use a bit pot if you would like, and ignore or eat through the damage. final mechanic is something called the Scarab Healer, and these scarabs, when spawned, will take 24 seconds to walk over and charge up a heal ability for Vermyx. Again, you generally tend to ignore this as it doesn't manage to get off the heal before you kill Vermyx. Now that we've gone through all of the mechanics, let's talk through how you actually deal with it. We'll start with a pre-battle rotation. Again, I've put this rotation on screen for you to perform. Now we have our prep work done. Simply surge in, moving slightly to the left, and for phase 1 you're going to use Death Skulls, Bloat, Soul Sap, your tier 90 spec if you have one stored in an EOF, and then Touch of Death. Continue with basics after this, and soon good old Vermyx will be phased. You may get a Moonstone Shard mechanic. Just be prepared to move if you see a pop-up saying so. You'll have just under 4 seconds to move out of the way afterwards. Now, having phased Vermyx, you're now in the Soul Rush mechanic. So pray ranged and move west and stand on the boxes when they appear. If you successfully divert the souls, it will tell you in a chat box. Divert 3 souls successfully and move back into the center portion of the stage. Now, if you don't manage to redirect all 3 souls, you'll face the Wormfire mechanic. It's no biggie. Just move back into the central portion of the arena and wait for the mechanic to finish and collect the remaining souls. You'll see on screen what happens if you don't manage to divert the souls. I surge over to the center, wait for it to finish, and then I go back and collect the last souls. Easy peasy. Now we move into phase 2. Move back into the center onto Vermyx and cast Bloat, and then follow up with a basic Death Essence rotation. So for you who don't know necessarily, Death Essence is a special attack stored inside the Omniguard. It empowers your auto attacks after using the following 3 abilities: Touch of Death, Finger of Death, or Death Skulls. So this attack would look something like the tier 92 special, auto attack, Finger of Death, auto attack, Touch of Death, auto attack, another Finger of Death, and then another auto attack. Now, very shortly after this, Vermyx should be phased or super close to being phased. Use a few more basics if you need to, and then afterwards, you'll have successfully phased Vermyx. This time move to the east, and we're going to deal with another Soul Rush ability. Redirect the souls as before, praying ranged as you go. Now, if you miss some souls, move back to the center to avoid the Wormfire. Now, it is worthwhile extending the life of your Conjurers here with life transfer, and if you're close enough to one of these other snakes, continue to build adrenaline on the snake in front of you. Now, with that over with, on to the final phase. Move back to the center. For this, you'll simply use a basic Living Death rotation. So this may look like Living Death followed by an Adrenaline Renewal or Replenishment Potion, followed by Touch of Death, and then Death Skulls and Split Soul. If you've got lots of souls that you can utilize, by all means, use a volley of souls. And I would say it is worthwhile using Disruption Shield whilst using Split Soul as well, potentially even Vengeance or Reflect. Build up as many Necrosis stacks as you need, pop off a couple of fingers, use another Death Skulls, whatever you need to do, and then basically just drain all of your currency stacks that you've got with Necromancy, and Vermyx should die very quickly after. I'll say during this phase, if you're a little bit slow on damage, that's okay, but you may face the Soul Bomb ability. When you see it, you can either move out of the way when you see the mechanic lighting up on the floor, or alternatively, utilize one of the Vitality Potions in your inventory and eat through the damage. Once you finish that, Vermyx will be close to death if she's not finished already. Unload whatever else you have and use a few basics or a bloat if needed, but after that, you should be plain sailing. That's Vermyx sorted. Let's now take a look at Kezalam the Wanderer. Kezalam is quite similar to Hellweir, except that he's stunnable, so this is where your Dreadnips will come in very useful. The stuns will delay his mechanics from occurring, which means you'll have an easier time when dealing with him. Talking of mechanics, let's go through some. Vast majority of his mechanics are movement based. One of those is Sanctum Blast, which has 3 variants. The first of the 3 variants is the Scattered Blast, and the other 2 are targeted on your position and appear as either a line on you or alternatively a square around Kezalam. Scatter mechanic is actually very easy to deal with. There are a couple of points in the arena where you can stand and you'll never be hurt by this mechanic. If you look at the 4 squares I've highlighted, these are where I stand throughout the fight, and this renders me completely immune to his scattered blasts. Now, this does actually have 2 reasons. Firstly, you avoid the scattered Sanctum Blast every single time, but also there is a second reason for this, and it means that you can choose where the targeted blasts land as well. By standing here, the way to deal with the targeted blast will be to run inwards towards Kezalam, and then afterwards run out back to the original position from where you were standing. Sometimes if you react too late, You can use dive to take you there faster. If you face the line blast mechanic, however, just move a few squares out of the way. It's not a very difficult mechanic at all. One of his other mechanics is a royal pain. It's the prison bomb. It will stun you, imprison you in a block of ice, and then damage you for quite a lot if you're still there about 6 seconds later. The way to deal with this mechanic is by using freedom when you're stunned or anticipation ahead of time, and then doing 7,000 damage to one of the crystals in one of the 4 cardinal directions. Don't worry, I'll be taking you through how I deal with them, which makes the process significantly easier to deal with. One of his other mechanics is his unstable scarabs. If you leave them there for 30 seconds, they will detonate and they will hit you for 6,000 damage each. Now, you won't likely see them with the rotation I'll provide. However, the way to deal with them is to hit them with a stun attack like Soul Strike. They only have 2,000 health and so are very, very easy to dispatch. The last mechanic that Kezalam has in his arsenal is called the Moonstone Obelisks. They have 60,000 health and will heal Kezalam for 6,000 health every 3 seconds. So with this, it is quite important to DPS them quickly to avoid dragging out the fight for longer than is strictly necessary. Now we've covered his mechanics, let's go through phase 1. Again, you'll complete your pre-combat ritual of summoning. Again, I've put the rotation back up on screen. We'll dive onto this point right here, which renders your first mechanic void, as the Scattered Blast will not hit you at all. You'll drop a Dreadnought down and cast Bloat, followed by Death Skulls. Build yourself back up to 100% adrenaline using basics, and then go into a Living Death rotation. Shortly after the first mechanic, Kezalam will start building to the next mechanic, which is the Ice Bomb Prison. Pretty much every time, if you can't skip the mechanic, it'll appear during the first of the Death Skulls of your Living Death rotation. This will mean that the skulls will bounce off of Kezalam and go straight onto the skulls, freeing you immediately. Just use freedom and walk out into one of the other safe squares, DPSing as you go with things like your Finger of Deaths or alternatively your Death Skulls. If you're a little bit slow on the damage, then you'll face another Sanctum Blast. This time it will be targeted on your position. So all you're going to do is just do the hokey cokey. If you're standing on one of the safer squares, move inwards towards Kezalam, and then straight afterwards, once that's done and exploded, you'll then move back to your original position to keep you safe from harm. DPS until you've phased him and then move on to the crystals. The pillar, use Death Skulls followed by a Finger of Death and then a Touch of Death. Use some basics and then potentially another Finger of Death if the fight is dragging on. At this point here, that it may be worthwhile using Life Transfer and healing your HP back using Soul Split. Once the pillar has been dealt with, I like to dive onto the safe squares on the opposite side of the arena and drop down another Dreadnought. Kezalam will finish with whatever special he was charging up previously. So if you were super quick on DPS and you managed to avoid the Prison Bomb, that's likely what you'll get this time. Now, after that mechanic goes through, he'll then move on to his next rotation and use a targeted Sanctum Blast, so prepared to do the hokey cokey once more. In terms of your own rotation, use a Bloat and then command your skeleton, and if you have one left inside of your Living Death ultimate timer, use another Death Skulls. Once this is done, complete a Death Essence rotation once more, so this will look like a tier 92 special attack, followed by an auto attack, followed by a Finger of Death, then another auto attack, then a Touch of Death, then another auto attack. Feel free to apply a Bloat at the end and build up some of the Necrosis and Soul stacks with basics. If you're a little bit slower on the DPS side, it's likely that you'll get another Prison Bomb. If that's the case, use freedom and tackle it with basics. Very shortly after, move onto the pillar, casting Invoke as you go and use a Death Skulls and command your skeleton whilst continuing to build stacks with basic attacks. If you can Life Transfer again, do so to extend your summons. This should finish off the pillar quite easily, and now you're going to be entering into the final phase of Kezalam. Move back onto one of your safe squares and be prepared for some Sanctum Blasts to come your way. Deal with them as you have before and get ready with your own rotation. You're going to drop a Dreadnought down and then use Split Soul. Follow up then with Bloat, then Volley of Souls, command your skeleton and use all of the Necrosis stacks that you've been saving on Fingers, and once that's all drained, if you have it, use a tier 90 special attack to finish it off, and use any other abilities if it's not yet finished off. So basically just do what you can to DPS the boss down. This should be then a very successful kill for you. It's unlikely that you'll see any more mechanics past the Sanctum Blast, as long as you've kept aside all of the odds and sods in terms of your currencies like your souls and your Necrosis stacks, etc. Okay, so for me, Nakatra is actually less annoying than Kezalam to deal with in normal mode. This is purely and simply because there's not really any stun mechanics there, but speaking of mechanics, let's take you through them. The mechanic that you will see most often is the Soulfire waves. Waves travel down the arena towards you and will deal magic damage. You will have a couple of seconds each time to move out of the way once the mechanic indicator has run down the arena. Now, there is a variant to this, which is in phase 3. And again, like I said, I'll talk about it later, but Nakatra has a different variant of wave, which appears as 8 lines traveling out from the center. These will be going in all 4 cardinal directions, as well as diagonally. You would deal with this mechanic exactly the same how you would the original. You just step outside of the lines and you're completely safe. The second mechanic is Obliterate. Now, this is an extremely high-hitting magic ability which can easily bust through all of your HP, dealing up to 15,000 damage. The way to deal with this is to either use Disruption Shield or Divert or Resonance, or alternatively you can also use Devotion as well, but I prefer the previous 3. In fact, my initial preference is to use Divert, as it gives you a lot of free adrenaline, which gives you access to even better abilities and potentially even better DPS rotations. The third mechanic is Scarabs, which pairs again with the Soulfire waves. So Nakatra summons 2 Scarabs, one which stands still and only has 2,000 HP. This Scarab will blow up after about 30 seconds and do 6,000 damage to you. This is similar to those at Kezalam. A small stun attack will deal with this, so using a Soul Strike ability is normally the best way forward. The second Scarab moves towards Nakatra like the first Scarab over at Vermyx, and after 30 seconds or so will heal Nakatra for double the health points left in the Scarab. I find the best way to deal with this is to use the tier 90 special attack stored in the EOF. This special attack stuns and does a lot of damage, so will quickly dispatch of the last remaining Scarab. Now, the only thing that makes it slightly complicated is you have to do this while staying outside of the fire. The fourth mechanic is Sanctum Hieroglyphs. Soulfire will appear at random based on the glyphs on the walls to the south and west. You'll need to dive to the safe areas that aren't glowing. This will need to be done twice in a row, but don't worry, because successfully dodging the mechanic the first time will bring your dive off of cooldown, ready for another dive. This actually happens straight after you move into phase 2 with Nakatra. You will definitely see this mechanic. Once Nakatra, however, reaches 320,000 HP, she will summon 2 dogs called Nephthys. They will appear both to the north and south and will have 60,000 HP respectively. They will empower Nakatra periodically, howling once their blue bars are full and giving Nakatra Devourer's Corruption, which increases her damage output. Now, the dogs themselves deal melee damage and also can disable reflect curses. So for this, I prefer to stand within melee distance and use Soul Split and just eat through the damage if I need to. Now, Nakatra will actually also heal these dogs throughout the phase and will use the Soulfire waves and then the Crossfire waves, which was the variant that I mentioned earlier. I find the best way to deal with this mechanic is to approach it the same way you did Kezalam's targeted Sanctum Blast. Just moving forwards and backwards based on where the waves are whilst doing damage will help you avoid the waves. Now, it is very important that you stand close to them, as if you get too far away, it will massively reduce the damage if you stand outside of their melee distance. Now, once you've killed the hounds, you'll face the next mechanic, which is the Shadow Sands Devourer. Now, you will actually have a couple of seconds just before you're pulled down into the Shadow Sands to do some additional DPS on Nakatra. That being said, though, it is only a few seconds. Some people, what they will prefer to do is either pre-bloat or alternatively use a command skeleton on Nakatra so you can identify when she is no longer immune from damage, and then afterwards follow up with a volley of souls. Now, the only problem is if you mistime it, you can waste an entire volley of souls on Nakatra without doing any damage whatsoever. The choice is yours, but once you get the hang of the timing, it really isn't too bad. Like I said, after this, you're going to be pulled into the Shadow Sands, where a 30-second timer will appear under the boss health, and gorillas will hit you with melee from afar. What you need to do is look at the hieroglyphs on the floor and memorize what they are with simple descriptions. On the screen in front of you, you should see all of the possible hieroglyphs that appear. So just as an example, my simple names for this are spider, snakes, triangle, crescent, monkey, dog, monk, cat, crocodile, scarab, and hourglass. Memorizing these are very important, as 2 of these glyphs will appear on your exit and a third will appear that wasn't there before, but I'll move more onto that later. Once you've got the glyphs in your head, head over to the purple smoke called the Soul Storm. Press on it and 2 felines will appear with 15,000 HP. I prefer to deal with them using the Threads of Fate. You could then use Soul Sap, followed by a Volley of Souls and a basic attack. My preference though is to use Threads of Fate and then just use basic attacks because I don't want to waste a Volley of Souls here. Once these are dealt with, collect the 3 soul fragments which will appear on the ground. You need to collect them before the time reaches 0. Now, normally I actually have loads of time spare here, so if I haven't already, I will actually resummon my conjures and make sure I have 100% adrenaline by targeting the gorillas to build up on them. Once you've collected the fragments, you'll be teleported back to Nakatra. Now, Nakatra will charge an attack which will KO you if your next step isn't right. You'll see 3 glyphs on the ground. Stand on the one that wasn't there in the Shadow Sands. This will render all attacks thereafter void for a limited time. Now for the final mechanic, which is the Sanctum Shockwave. Nakatra will perform a burst attack, which is waves, and they gradually consume the arena. The trick to this one is to let the first of the 3 waves activate, and then move from the second wave into the first. She'll perform this move twice, so it's important to go back to the original position, and once again perform the hokey cokey. Now, I completely understand it all sounds very complicated, but there are some mechanics that you won't even have to deal with if you follow my rather flexible rotation. So let's get into the battle itself. Now, before going in, complete your pre-battle rotation with your summons, etc. I'll put it up again once more on screen. After this, surge and dive to these squares in the northwest. Now, it isn't mandatory for it to be in the northwest. It's just my preference from my runs in hard mode. But any one of the squares shown on screen are absolutely fine. This is so that when you're close, if you've ever had to deal with the scarabs, which you probably won't have to here, it will also put you in a good position for the Sanctum Glyphs mechanic, as well as the scarabs themselves. So to start with, you're going to use Bloat, and then Death Skulls building to 100% with basics, and then going to a Living Death rotation. This should finish off P1 very quickly, leading straight into Phase 2. During this beginning point, you'll face the Soulfire waves first. As a mechanic, simply move to the left or the right to dodge them. Now, if you don't phase Nakatra before her next mechanic, you'll be exposed to the Obliterate mechanic. I would suggest using Divert for a burst of adrenaline. Once phased, you'll face the glyphs on the floor, ready up to dive and go to the safe spots that are represented by the lack of glowing on the floor. Let's enter into Phase 2. You continue your Living Death rotation, so command your skeleton, then use a Finger of Death, use a couple of basics, another Finger of Death, and then potentially a Death Skulls. Reapply your Bloat and use some more fingers, and you may face another Obliterate attack with the waves, so use one of your defensive abilities that aren't on cooldown, Disruption Shield for example, and continue to move outside of the waves. Very soon, you will have phased Nakatra into Phase 3. It's at this point that Nakatra summons up her 2 dogs. So with these 2 dogs summoned, Nakatra will keep attacking you with the waves and the cross waves. With these waves, again, simply move out of the way. For the first dog, use Invoke, cast Split Soul, Bloat, and then follow up with the Death Skulls. This should pretty much kill the dog, but follow up with some basics just in case. After that's been killed, move on to the second dog, making sure to stay out of the way of the fire. For me, I prefer to surge and then dive to the spot, so it means that I won't take any damage with this. Use Invoke and then go into a Death Essence rotation, so a tier 92, then a basic, Finger of Death, and then a basic, and then a Touch of Death, and then a basic. This will also kill that one off quickly. If you are a little too slow here, the dog will be healed by Nakatra for a small amount, but just keep at the DPS whilst dodging the flames. Now, like I said, after the second one has died, you do have a few seconds to damage Nakatra, but she may be immune for the first couple of seconds. Either command your skeleton or hit her with a Bloat just before the dog dies, and then you'll start seeing your regular hits. And when you do see those, use your Volley of Souls. Again, if you're not confident that you can make it in time before she puts on that heavy damage cap, just use basics and save your souls for later. It's at this point then you'll be dragged into the Shadow Sands. Memorize the glyphs on the floor, go over to the Smoke Soulstorm and click on it to spawn the 2 small felines. Use Threads of Fate, Soul Sap, Touch of Death, and then follow up with auto attacks and then more Soul Saps. If you have loads of spare time, like I said, feel free to use the gorillas to build up 100% adrenaline before clicking on the 3 fragments to be teleported back out. Once out, move towards the Bogey glyph and stand on it. While she fluffs about trying to hit you with that, simply go into a basic Living Death rotation like the one shown on screen. Use everything you've got, and if you saved the souls before, use them now. She'll be stunned for about 11 seconds after that mechanic, so you really do have quite a bit of good time to really get some damage out. I would suggest you stand just in front of the square that I've highlighted on screen, as this is the edge of the second wave, which will prepare you for the next mechanic. So the Sanctum shockwave is coming, so we're going to do the hokey cokey, moving forwards and backwards whilst continuing our DPS rotation. If you are a little on the slow side, she may hit you, like I said, with an obliterate. Just pop a resonance or a disruption shield and carry on DPSing. With this rotation, you shouldn't face any more mechanics, and congratulations, you've just killed the boss. So all I ask is that if you found this video helpful, please don't forget to like and consider subscribing to the channel. In the meantime, if you need a home, my clan is open to new people. We welcome skillers, killers, and clue chasers alike. I'll put more info of that into the description. Now, I also do stream on Twitch most Fridays at 7 PM UK time, and even some evenings around 8 PM if you wanted to come and chat to me. In the meantime, though, all I wanted to say, happy scaping.